everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right into studying some Jewish history together. Over the past number of sessions, we've been discussing the depressing centuries of the second half of the Common Era, starting with the Crusades, moving forward with the Jews being kicked out of Western Europe, France, Germany, and England, going on to the Black Death and the pogroms that followed, the Khmelnytsky massacres in the Ukraine and Poland, and on the tails of all that, we had the false messiahship of Shabtai Tzvi, and all of this just left the Jewish people in a national state of depression. And there was a ripe atmosphere, no matter where you were in the Jewish world, for change, for new movements, for revolutions, for isms. And therefore, over the next couple weeks, we're going to discuss the rise of many of these revolutions. A lot of them still are being waged or fought or still playing out until this very day. And we're going to discuss how they affected the Jewish world at their time and how they've continued to affect the Jewish world until today. Now, the first trend that we're going to discuss is the Reform movement. And we discussed last week that the Reform movement was not only ripe to happen because of what had been going on in the Jewish world, and many people were ready to get out of the ghetto, or ready for a change, ready to do things different, but the rest of the world was going through revolution. The Reform movement starts at the same time as the French Revolution, and then the overflow that takes in different ways, shapes, and form and throughout the world. The American Revolution, obviously in America, eventually the Napoleonic Revolutions, which we'll discuss. So the way that this affects the Jewish world is through the Reform movement. Now, Reform was a whole new phenomenon in many ways. Now, this is not the first time that we had dissenting opinions on how to approach Judaism, that we had sectarianism. As if you've been an ardent Jewish discovery, Jewish Destiny series follower from the beginning, you know that we discussed in prophetic times, you had the rebellion of Jews who were involved in idol worship, and then you had the rebellion of the Sadducees, or actually before that you had the Hellenists, then you had the Sadducees, then the Karaites. So the idea of sectarianism within Judaism is nothing new. One thing that we have seen in every single case is while many of these movements have gained sound and splendor and come in a force and even take over the Jewish world in numbers and even have the majority sometimes, it's interesting that none of them stand the test of time. Even though if you look at certain snapshots in time, you would think that this movement is going to be the new Judaism. For example, the Sadducees, they were the entire of the priesthood, the entirety of the priesthood of the Jewish people, the aristocracy, and probably the majority in numbers too. The Karaites in certain parts of the Jewish world were a majority. So you would think that would become the new Judaism. And while they might take a few hundred years to play out, they are almost not heard of today at all. And that's because we have to remember a phenomenon that we've talked about many a times. We mentioned it last week with Rav Yaakov Emden. We mentioned it when we talk about Shavuos, the holiday that just passed, and that is the fact that Jewish people have a guarantee. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, makes a guarantee before he passes away in the book of Deuteronomy that the Jewish people will have a tumultuous history. They will be scattered throughout the world. They will remain few in number. They'll be oppressed. They'll be persecuted. They will have, like we said, a tumultuous time on the map of world history, but in the end, we will survive, we'll return to the land of Israel, and we will herald in the Messianic era. Now, who does that guarantee go for? And by the way, Moses' words were prophetic in his time, but history has come to validate them 100%. But who was that prophecy for? Was it for the people who stuck with the teachings of Moshe, or the people who abandoned the teachings of Moshe? Well, obviously the people who stick with the teachings of Moshe. And therefore, while these groups, or the sectarian groups, have gained sound and splendor and numbers and power and money and whatever it is, they don't have the guarantee, and therefore they go the ways of many other movements of history and play themselves out, and within a few generations usually are gone. Now, for us in 2022, we still look around and we see a Jewish world where the majority of the Jews who affiliate, now probably half of the people in the world who are Jews do not actually affiliate or practice Judaism, which is a very sad number. But of the half that identify as Jews, who practices Jews, the largest population is what we call Orthodox Jews, at about 2 million worldwide. Obviously the most being in the land of Israel, but about 2 million worldwide. The second largest group is the Reform movement at about 1.5 million, and then the conservative movement is a distant third. And we'll get to the conservative movement later. They are the youngest of these movements, and while they have their time of glory, they fizzle out pretty quickly and are definitely in a decline nowadays. So we already see a situation where the Reform movement is on the decline, and it could be it's going to play out as we have seen with these other sectarian groups throughout history who end up denying and defying the Torah of Moshe. So, but when they come in the 18th century and the 19th century, it totally takes the Jewish world and Germany by storm. Now, Germany was France was the first country to emancipate the Jews. Germany was the first country to really do it en masse, and Germany had a much larger Jewish population than France did. When France emancipates the Jews in 1791, there's only 50,000 Jews in France. Now, Germany, where the Jews had also been expelled, like in France, they hadn't been expelled as many times. I think in France they were expelled 4 or 5 times. And in Germany, while they had been expelled, there had been overtures in the Holy Roman Empire to bring the Jews back, to protect the Jews, and the relationship had waxed and waned. So while there was a low point in the Jewish population of Germany after the Black Death and the pogroms that following that with the holy, or as I call it, the not so holy Roman Empire, because it wasn't so holy and it wasn't so Roman, wasn't so much of an empire either, there are overtures to the Jews, and we'll see that the Jews do stick with Germany and are able to rebuild to numbers of about 500,000, which wasn't huge, considering that there were many millions more in the world, many million Jews in the world at this time, but about 500,000 are in Germany. So the Reform movement is only a Western Europe phenomenon, mainly in Germany. We'll see it goes into France a little bit with the 50,000 Jews that are there, but it is only in Western Europe. It never takes hold in Eastern Europe. Polish Jewry, Galician Jewry, Lithuanian Jewry, Russian Jewry, Ukrainian Jewry, etc. are not interested in the Reform movement. Sephardic Jewry, not interested in the Reform movement. It is purely at this point a Western European phenomenon, and almost specifically in Germany. And that's where the movement begins. As we mentioned last week, the intellectual forefather of the Reform movement was Moses Mendelssohn. He himself was an observant Jew his whole life, and had he seen where his philosophies took the world, so to speak, he might have never spoken them to the world. But be it as it may, he is credited with being the intellectual forefather of all of this. But the movement really starts not just as a philosophy, but in actions in 1808. And the first man to start to make the reforms of reform is a man by the name of Israel Jacobson. Now, Israel Jacobson lived in a small town in Germany known as Seessen, which is in the Lower Saxony region of Germany, basically the middle of the modern-day German state. And in 1808, he established a school with Jews and Christians together. Some sort of a school where that was not really done before the emancipation of the Jews in Germany, but he leads a school of Jews and Christians together with the goal of trying to integrate the Jews and the Christians so the Jews can be emancipated. 2 years later, in 1810, is what is actually July 17th, 1810, is considered the founding of the Reform movement. That's the anniversary of the founding of the Reform movement, because it's on that day that Jacobson opens a prayer house in his hometown. Now, he calls it a temple. Now, part of the reason why he called it a temple was because in other places in Western Europe, that term was already being used for Jewish prayer houses, but it had a philosophical connotation as well, and we'll see why that is the term that really stuck in the Reform movement, because as we'll see their philosophy develop, they are going to move very drastically away from the traditional Jewish belief of the return to Zion, the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, the rebuilding of the temple, and therefore they say their synagogues are temples. They don't need a temple in Jerusalem. So even though when Jacobson chooses the name temple, it probably did not have those connotations, the name will stick because that will become the connotations. Now, his focus over here was that he felt that the reason why a lot of young German Jews were not so interested in synagogue was because the synagogues did not have so much decorum, and they weren't so much in line with German culture and the prim and proper way of the German man. So therefore, he looked at the Lutheran Protestant churches in his area and saw how prim and proper, the decorum, and how beautiful they were, and he modeled his prayer house, his temple, after those Lutheran Protestant churches in his area. Now, what did he do? What were the changes that he made? He introduced into the prayer service certain German prayers, certain prayers that were going to be said in German. He changed that the drasha, or the sermon, should no longer be said in Yiddish, which was the Jewish vernacular. Instead, should be said in German, which the languages are similar, but it was strictly German. He instituted a confirmation ceremony similar to what the Protestant church does, and he took out the mechitza, the partition separating men and women. Now, he did not mix the seating. The men and women still sat separately because in the Lutheran Protestant churches, the men and women sat separately. And not only was that in Germany, even into America, in many of the Protestant churches, the men and women sat separately. So he took out the physical mechitza, but kept the separate seating. And he instituted a choir, and he instituted an organ player, an organ being played during the services. Now, the organ was played by a Gentile because he was still focused on Jewish law. His goal initially was not to stray from Jewish law. The service fulfilled the obligations of a minyan and the laws of tefillah, the laws of prayer. And even though he took out the physical mechitza, men and women still sat separately. So he was still sensitive to a halacha. So even though he instituted an organ music into the service, the organ was always played by a Gentile. Now, one of the other things he does, which is quite interesting, is he changes the havara of the Hebrew, the pronunciation of the Hebrew in his synagogue, from the classical Ashkenazi pronunciation to the Sephardic pronunciation. Now, this was culturally a little bit silly because he was not Sephardic. No one in Germany was Sephardic, and most Jews in Germany had probably never ever seen or met a Sephardic Jew in their life. Yet Jacobson felt that the pronunciation, the Sephardic pronunciation, was a cleaner pronunciation, and there's probably also a goal to make that line in the sand, that he didn't want to be associated with the old European Ashkenazi Jews that he was trying to kind of get away from, so he chose the Sephardic pronunciation to be the pronunciation in his temple. Now, what's interesting, if we fast forward for a moment to the modern state of Israel, when the debate was being made as to what the language was going to be in the pre-state Israel and in the old Yishuv, there were many languages that were being debated. Many wanted Yiddish because the founders of the state of Israel were the good old WASPs. They were the white Ashkenazi socialist paratroopers, right? But they were all Ashkenazim. The Sephardim were not involved at all in the government of the country until the 70s when Begin comes to power. So they're all Ashkenazim. So Yiddish was obviously a front runner. There were many who wanted French. In fact, Herzl, obviously long before the state was founded, felt that French should be the language of the Jewish state when it was to be established. In the end, Eliezer ben Yehuda and David ben Gurion won the battle with Hebrew, and specifically the Sephardic pronunciation, not because there was a majority of Sephardim there. There were very few Sephardim in the country at the time. The Sephardim don't come to Israel till the 1950s after the War of Independence, when all of the Arab countries kick out their Sephardic Jewish populations, and then they're second-class citizens for several decades. I always like to quote my friend, Dr. and Mrs. Israeli. Dr. Israeli's father, he should live and be well, who's a Sephardic Jew from Israel, now lives here in Cleveland, and he always likes to say that when he lived in Israel, he was black, and now he moved to America and became white. In other words, that in many ways, the way that the African American population in America has been mistreated for a very long time, that's how Sephardic Jews are often treated in Israel. So the fact that Ben Gurion and Ben Yehuda chose the Sephardic pronunciation had nothing to do with Sephardim. They despised the Sephardim. They were terrible to the Sephardim. But it was the idea of wanting to make that separation from the old Ashkenazi European way of speaking Hebrew. Okay, so Jacobson does the same thing in his prayer house in Germany. Now, his little prayer house in the little area of Germany that he was in goes largely unnoticed, and it fizzles out by the year 1813. At this point, Jacobson moves to Berlin, which is east of where he was, and in Berlin, much bigger community, many more Jews. He meets many other people who are into the ideas of reform. They didn't call it reform yet, but into the ideas of changing Judaism and making changes. And there he finds a ready audience for his prayer house concept. And he opens prayer houses in Berlin and around Berlin, and then all over Germany and places where there were larger Jewish populations, modeled after what he originally started. And the trend just continues. It starts to pick up steam. And as Jews become emancipated in Germany, they become more and more into this idea of basically praying like a German Lutheran Protestant. In 1818, the idea comes to a head in Hamburg, one of the largest Jewish communities in Germany, with the founding of the new Israelite temple. And this incorporated everything from Jacobson and even took it many steps further. For example, they removed any mentions from their prayer book of the restoration of the sacrificial service, of the Messianic era, of the return to Zion. All of that was taken out of their prayer book. And it was, if we think back to Maimonides' 13 principles of faith, one of the main principles of faith is that there will be a Messianic era. That's number 12. Number 13 is there will be a resurrection of the dead. That's all taken out of this early Reform prayer book. So you can see how it is at this point is really moving pretty far away from traditional Judaism. 400 people attend the first service. Now, the service in the synagogue and the temple is fought vehemently by the local rabbinate. The rabbis protested it, and the rabbis at that point had the backing of the government. To be a rabbi, you had to be approved by the government. So for the next 20 years or so, the rabbinic leadership in Germany is able to basically suppress these temples and prayer houses from getting started, even though they kept trying to start. The rabbis would put them down. One of the main opponents at this point was the famous Rebbe Akiva Eger, but there were others as well. And for the next 20 years, it flounders. But like with any revolution, quite often when you try and put it down, it just gains steam in the underground until the point where the numbers are on its side and is able to take over the establishment en masse. And that is what we see happen by the 1930s. Now, enter the scene in 1930s a man by the name of Abraham Geiger. Abraham Geiger is really considered the forefather of the Reform movement because he builds on the ideas of Mendelssohn, builds on the temple concept of Jacobson, and is the first one to start to put the Reform philosophy down on paper, so to speak, and establish what the movement is going to be and what the movement is going to believe in and not going to believe in. Now, it's interesting because Geiger was a scholar, and one of the things that he was most famous for was that he was very focused on the idea of the Karaites. And he wrote, I believe his doctoral thesis was about the Karaites, and he often fought for the position that when the Karaites came onto the scene in the 8th, 9th century, whatever it was, that they were just a continuation of the Sadducees. The Sadducees from before, from 800 years before them, had never really died out. They'd gone kind of dormant, kind of underground, and the Karaites reinvigorated that movement, and therefore the Karaites were not some new movement when they came on the scene in the 9th century. They were an old movement that dated back to the Second Temple times. And the Sadducees were an old movement that dated before them. And he fought for this idea that again, the concept of sectarianism, of saying that the rabbinic authority was not the only opinion, of saying that there's no afterlife, of saying all these things that the Sadducees said, that he claimed to continue on. And in many ways, Geiger is often referred to as a Karaite. Now, he never called himself a Karaite, and it was never a name he gave himself, but he was definitely had an obsession with the Karaites, and therefore many would just address him as such. Maybe not in front of him, but that's the idea that many of the ideas that he brought back to the world. So in the first meeting that Geiger holds in 1837 with a coalition of others who believed in these ideas of changing Judaism, he stands up at that meeting when the goal is to write out their new theology, and he says the statement, "The Talmud must go." And with those 4 words. He drew the line in the sand that the new movement was not going to be a movement based on halacha. It was not going to be a movement based on the Pharisaic tradition, of the Talmudic tradition, the tradition of Moshe, the tradition of the Torah given at Sinai, everything that we spoke about before, that guarantee that Moshe gives us that we're going to exist forever. When Geiger stands up and says the Talmud must go, that's the end of the guarantee for those followers. And it's only a matter of time before it fizzles out. And the philosophy that they wrote down was that the German Jewry should be Germans in the streets and Jews at home. In other words, being a German, so to speak, should come first. You did not have to follow the mitzvos. You no longer had to follow the commandments of the Torah. He came up with a concept called Prophetic Judaism, meaning that if you take Judaism and you ignore the 5 books of Moses, where there's obviously Moshe and all the laws of the Torah, and you ignore the Talmud, which he said that must go, you're left with the writings of the prophets, and most specifically the latter prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Yeshaya, Yecheskel, Yirmiyahu, the Treyasar. And if you read the ideas of the latter prophets, you have these lofty ideas of social justice and equality, and they don't talk a lot about the mitzvos. They don't talk a lot about following the Torah. So Geiger grabbed onto that. He said the Reformed Judaism was going to be prophetic Judaism. They were going to follow in the ways of the prophets, and the prophets came after Moshe, so obviously they reigned supreme. And he claimed that they themselves didn't follow the Torah, and that when the Tanaim and the Amoraim of the Talmud came along later, they just bastardized the whole thing, so we could get rid of that, and the Talmud was only meant to be studied as a historical book that the Jews used to follow, but that was not what they were going to follow. And that's the concept that he put forward. No Hebrew. He said there would be no Hebrew at all in their synagogues. Everything would only be German. And as they had every 5 years or so, they had these meetings to constantly test the water, see how far they could push, see what people are accepting, and continue to make changes. In fact, in 1846, they abolished the second day of Yontiv and made it that even outside the land of Israel, because they were in Germany, that no longer was there a need to observe 2 days of Yontiv. All references of Zion, of returning to Israel, were removed from the prayer book. As we said before, that was in Hamburg already, but that was solidified as a philosophy that there was not a goal to return to Israel. And that was really the position of the Reform movement until the 1950s, 1960s. A lot of the early opposition to the state of Israel was from the Reform movement. And I always say that that's, I think, one of the reasons why they kind of get their just desserts now when they're fighting for acceptance in the state of Israel. Well, for so long they fought against the state of Israel. Now they want to be accepted by the state of Israel. Well, I think that's just the just desserts from their earlier actions. Now, there are some haunting words that the great Rabbi Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, known as the Or Sameach and Meshech Chochmah, those are his 2 most famous works. And his work, the Meshech Chochmah, and he wrote this in I believe in the 1920s, he wrote the words really from the Parshas Bechukosai, which came a few weeks ago, describing how essentially what was going on in Western Europe was exactly what the Torah was talking about in Parshas Bechukosai. And that there would be this diminishing of connection to the Almighty, that the Jews wouldn't want to listen to the ways of Hashem anymore, they would despise the chukim and the laws and the statutes of the Torah. And then he says some haunting words. He says, what happens to that community is they get to the point, V'yachshiv hi Berlin ki Yerushalayim, that they call Berlin Jerusalem. And that's exactly what the early Reform movement did. Now, what's scary is, if you know your Chumash is in the context, is what does Parshas Bechukosai talk about? It talks about the Teichacha, the calamities that will befall the Jewish people when they stray away from Hashem. And when you read the calamities, the Teichacha of Bechukosai, and then again in Kisavo, and you hold up a history of the Holocaust, we'll leave it at there's a lot of similarities. So it was almost prophetic words that Rav Meir Simcha spoke in the 1910s, 1915, whenever he wrote that. But that's really the Reform movement had gone. They said there's no more Jerusalem, we have Berlin. They moved the Sabbath service, or the main service, because they didn't observe the Shabbos, but they moved the main service from Shabbos to Sunday, and their goal was really to be a conduit for assimilation. Now, today's Today, I don't think that's the goal of the Reform movement in America. The Reform movement in America, I think, looks at themselves as a stopgap, as trying to at least offer some Judaism for the people who are assimilated here in America. But they were trying to help the Jews assimilate, and they were phenomenally successful to the point where early reform, German reform, will completely die out because within a few generations, all of the descendants of the early reformers and their congregations are going to have intermarried and gone far away from Judaism. And by the time the Nuremberg laws come about in 1933 to make the marriage of Jew and Gentile forbidden in Germany, you're going to have more than half of German Jewry that's going to be intermarried. So as a conduit to assimilation, the early Reform movement in Germany was very, very successful. But as we said, their success was really only in Germany and a little bit in France, because there's this trick when it comes to assimilation. It takes two to tango, so to speak, and that the Jews can only assimilate as much as the Gentiles will let them. And I think that's one of the reasons why that the Reform movement only really takes hold in Germany and France, Western Europe, because in Eastern Europe, the Jews had not been emancipated. And not only that had they been emancipated, there was no desire of the Jew to be like the Gentile in Poland, Ukraine. They did not want to be like their Gentile neighbor. So we're going to see that these waves and winds of assimilation will come to Eastern Europe in a very different way, and what we call the Haskalah, we mentioned that before, the Enlightenment, but it won't be necessarily a goal to assimilate like the Western Europe, to assimilate with their neighbors, but it'll be a goal of bringing the Western European culture to Eastern Europe, and that'll happen a little bit later. Now, within 50 years in Germany, the success is overwhelming. It takes over 90% in Germany, and so much so that we're gonna talk about in a few sessions the opposition and the eventual opponent who really totally turns the tide in Germany of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, how when he becomes the Rav in Frankfurt, he doesn't even have a Shomer Shabbos minyan. He doesn't even have 10 Shomer Shabbos Jews in the shul in Frankfurt. And he is going to slowly but surely bring that community and many other German Jewish communities back to traditional Judaism in the late 1800s. But in this time period, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it takes over like wildfire, spreads throughout Germany until Hirsch will come along and stem those tides and turn things back in the other direction. Now, it's at the same time, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of different ways throughout these next few sessions, but it's at the same time that America has been founded as a country. As we all know, America was founded as a country in 1776, and we know, as we mentioned before, that it's possible that Columbus himself was Jewish, but even if Columbus wasn't Jewish, there were definitely Jews on the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. There were definitely Jews in the New World in South America, because, by the way, Columbus never came to North America. He was only in South America. But there were definitely Jews in South America from the time of the 15th century and on. Now, it was not a large population, and it was strictly a Sephardic population, mainly those who had been running away from the Inquisition, and they were actually afraid that the Inquisition was going to come to the Spanish-controlled areas of South America, so the Jews always ran away from the Spaniards. They ran to the Dutch-controlled areas, eventually to the British-controlled areas. But in the late 18th century, in the year 1790, there were about 1,000 to 2,000 Jews in America, mainly Dutch Sephardim, and that was about the extent of it. Now, even though there was a very small population, there were some significant Jews. For example, in the Revolutionary War, there was a Jew by the name of Francis Salvador, who was actually the first Jew elected to political office in the New World, and he was known as Paul Revere of the South because he had a similar Paul Revere situation where he rode miles on his horse to warn that the British were coming. He eventually was unfortunately killed, but he was an early Jew who fought for the Revolutionary War. Chaim Salomon was one of the financiers of the Revolutionary War. So even though at the time of the Revolution in America, you only had a small Jewish population, the Jews were already making their mark in this country. And for the next 100 years or so, the numbers would grow a little bit, but still be fairly small. But we'll see that even when we come onto the Civil War in the 1860s, that the treasurer and eventually the Secretary of State of the Confederacy was Judah P. Benjamin, also a Jew. And he played a very significant role in the Confederacy. Now, at the same time, we had General Ulysses S. Grant, who will pass in 1862 General Order Number 11, expelling the Jews from the areas under his control in western Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Now, Lincoln will make him take that back, but again, small Jewish population in America, making their mark, not very significant. The initial growth of the American Jewish population goes from 1840, where there are about 15,000 Jews in the country, to 1880, after the Civil War, there's going to be 250,000 Jews in this country, in America. And again, mostly Sephardic at this time, not a lot of Ashkenazim yet, and heavily German. There's going to be a lot of Germans who are going to make their way after the Civil War to America. But since the early Jews who come are Sephardic, the initial congregations in America are Sephardic congregations. The first congregation in America is in Newport, Rhode Island, the Touro Synagogue. The building still stands. It's considered the oldest surviving synagogue building. There are also synagogues established in Savannah, Philadelphia, Baltimore, of course, New York, and South Carolina. Those are some of the other major communities. The largest continuous congregation of the Jewish world is in New York, the Shereth Israel congregation, again, Sephardic congregation, and those were the initial enclaves of the Jewish community here in America. Now, what happens with the rise of German-speaking Jews in America is that, sure enough, these ideas of what's going on in Germany in the mid-19th century, they make their way over to America as well. And the first place where we see the ideas of reform hit America are in the 1830s in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, at that point, in 1830, the year 1830, Charleston was the largest Jewish community in North America. Kind of interesting to think about, because while today there is still a Jewish community there, in fact, my mechutin grew up there, and his parents still live there. They should live and be well. Judge Garfinkel, still living in South Carolina and still a member of the shul there. That's one of the, I think, the oldest Orthodox shul in America. The third oldest after the two we mentioned. But it's the largest Jewish community in North America at that time. And the ideas of reform make their way there with the growing German Jewish population. There's a move to, urge the Jews to assimilate and to integrate into American culture. And in 1840, a man by the name of Gustav Poznański is successful in finally bringing the ideas of reform into the synagogue, which is called Beit Elohim. And they officially take over the congregation and bring the ideas of German reform to American soil in 1840. In 1842, the first German Jewish Reform congregation is founded in Baltimore, the Har Sinai congregation. I believe it still exists today on Reisterstown Road, at least the building's still there. And they adopt the Hamburg style completely, and that becomes the first synagogue founded in America as a Reform synagogue. In 1846, there's a man by the name of Isaac Mayer Weiss, who is appointed the rabbi of the congregation Bethel in Albany, New York, and he was in that position for 8 years, and he was pushing the ideas of reform. He thought that it was very important that his congregation should adopt these ideas of reform, and he started to make institutions along the lines of what was going on in Hamburg and what was going on in Germany. And first of all, he counted women for a minyan. He allowed men and women to sit together in family pews. There were still separate pews, but he allowed family pews. And he eliminated the bar mitzvah because he thought it was meaningless, because the boys weren't practicing Judaism anyways. And he instituted a co-ed choir of men and women singing together. And he famously remarked in a letter to the Charleston, South Carolina congregation they mentioned before, that he did not believe in the ideas of the Messiah or the resurrection of the dead. And all of this was a bit too much for his congregation in Albany, New York. And in 1850, they dismiss him as the rabbi, which he does not accept. and he shows up at the services the following day, which happened to be the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And at the moment when the Torah was being removed from the ark for the reading of the Torah, an altercation broke out between the people who backed Wise and the people who opposed Wise, and eventually the sheriff had to be called in, and the opponents of Wise were taken out of the synagogue, and he was taken out of the synagogue. Actually, everyone was cleared from the synagogue that day and was locked up, and at the end of that situation, it was clear that Weiss's time at Temple Bethel in Albany, New York had come to an end. His supporters found the Anshe Emeth congregation, but he kind of flounders for a few years. In 1853, he's offered a position in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was for 8 years before coming to Cleveland, of the B'nai Yeshurun congregation, or the Lodge Street Synagogue. Now, he accepted this position on condition that it would be a lifetime appointment, which the congregation agreed to. Now, at this point, Weiss was already a bit of a famous figure. He had already brought over not only the philosophies of Geiger to America, but he had started to organize the philosophies of Geiger in America, and he was a famous person. So what was such a famous person doing leaving New York and the East Coast for little old Cincinnati? Well, the answer is that at that point, Cincinnati was the second largest Jewish community in America. So in the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, it's the second largest community, and therefore it makes sense that he wants to go there, and that will become considered the home of American Reform Judaism. He'll make the Hebrew Union College the Reform Seminary in Cincinnati. It is now closing, but it lasts there for 100 and 150 years. And a lot of the early meetings will take place there to determine and to lay out the philosophies of American Reform Judaism, which will be very similar to what is going on in Germany. But he brings the organization to the movement, and it just grows from there and becomes the movement that it is for many, many generations. 1869 in Philadelphia, they have a meeting which they consider the American Reform Declaration of Independence. In other words, all attendants, all congregations represented at that meeting were clearly saying that they are part of the Reform movement, not part of the traditional synagogues anymore. And a few years later, in 1883, at the first graduating class for the Hebrew Union College, for the seminary that Weiss had established, there's different accounts of exactly what happened, but it seems it might have just been due to negligence of the caterer. But be it as it may, non-kosher dishes were served at the dinner, and it became known in posterity as the Treifa banquet. Now, there's different accounts as to what exactly happened. Was it just there were some non-kosher dishes? Was it that it was done deliberately? Was it out and out kosher like pork and shellfish? There's no real consensus as to what happened. Some accounts say that there were guests that left the hall in disgust and abandoned the movement from that point on, and that was in many ways the impetus for the conservative movement, which isn't exactly true, but be it as it may, it was also looked at as a line in the sand at the celebration of the first graduating class of the Rabbinical Assembly that treif, non-kosher food was served. In 1885, the platform is put down on what's called the Pittsburgh Platform in a meeting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the platform, again, very similar to Geiger, and it could just as well be a secular humanist platform. It, again, mentions no return to Zion. It mentions no use of Hebrew, no following of the Torah, that the Torah is just there as a historical document, but you don't have to follow it. And that is really where the Reform movement finds its beginnings in America. Now, between 1880 and 1914, with the outbreak of World War I and the beginning of isolationism in America, there are 2 million Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews, that will make their way to America. And that is going to be quite a balanced shift in what was going on, that really from up until the end of the 19th century, it's really just these small Sephardic congregations and Reform in America, and you're now going to have the Eastern European population coming over in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and it'll take a while for traditional Judaism to rebuild in America, because the way that things go quite often is whoever comes to a location first, they set the tone. Even if they're overruled in numbers subsequently, they will still set the tone. So the tone in America is going to clearly be set for those 50 years in the second part of the 19th century as reform, and it'll take at least 100 years for really the tides to turn until after World War II, when we'll see traditional Judaism start to gain a foot and then eventually thrive and prosper here in America. But that we'll discuss in a later session. But this is the beginning of reform, and in the coming weeks we'll discuss other movements, other philosophies, other ideas that either come as a response to reform, or they come in wake of the same situation, the same winds that bring about reform. And that'll be the Hasidic movement, the Musar movement, the Yeshiva movement, and on down the line from there with all the other isms of the 19th century. I look forward to discussing them with you. I look forward to seeing you next week, and I thank you so much for coming, and I thank you for listening.